Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Great Expectations. While we were comforting ourselves by the fire after our meal, the Jack, who was sitting in a corner and who had a bloated pair of shoes on, which he had exhibited while we were eating our eggs and bacon as interesting relics that he had taken a few days ago from the feet of a drowned seaman washed ashore, asked me if he had seen a four-oared galley going up with the tide. When I told him no, he said she must have gone down then, and yet she took up too, when she left there. They must have thought better on that for some reason or another, said Jack, and gone down. A four-oared galley, did you say? Said I. A four, said the Jack, and two sitters. Did they come ashore here? They put in with a stone 2-gallon jar for some beer. I'd have been glad to pice in the beer myself, said the Jack, or put some rattling psychic in it. Why? I know why, said the Jack. He spoke in a slushy voice, as if much mud had washed into his throat. He thinks, said the landlord, a weakly meditative man with a pale eye, who seemed to rely greatly on his Jack. He thinks there was what there wasn't. I know what he thinks. What I thinks, observed the Jack. You thinks custom us, Jack? Said the landlord. I do, said the Jack. Then you're wrong, Jack. Am I? In the infinite meaning of his reply and his boundless confidence in his views, the Jack took one of his bloated shoes off, looked into it, and knocked a few stones out on the kitchen floor and put it on again. He did this with the air of a Jack who was so right that he could afford to do anything. Why? What do you make out they done with their buttons, then, Jack? Asked the landlord, vacillating weakly. Done with their buttons, returned the Jack. Chucked 'em overboard. Swallowed 'em. Sewed 'em. To come up small, salad. Done with their buttons. Don't be cheeky, Jack, remonstrated the landlord, in a melancholy and pathetic way. A customs officer knows what to do with his buttons, said the Jack, repeating the obnoxious word with the greatest contempt. When they comes betwixt him and his own light, a 4 and 2 sitters don't go hanging and hovering, up with one tide and down with another, and both with and against another, with there being custom us at the bottom of it, saying which he went out in disdain, and the landlord, having no one to reply upon, found it impracticable to pursue the subject. This dialogue made us all uneasy, and made me very uneasy. The dismal wind was muttering round the house, the tide was flapping at the stone, and I had a feeling that we were caged and threatened. A four-oared galley, hovering about in so unusual a way as to attract this noise, was an ugly circumstance that I could not get rid of. When I had induced Provis to go up to bed, I went outside with my 2 companions. Startup by this time knew the state of the case, and held another council, whether we should remain at the house until the steamer's time, which would be out in the afternoon, or whether we should put off early in the morning, was the question we discussed. On the whole, we deemed it the better course to lie where we were, until within an hour or so of the steamer's time, and then to get out in her track, and drift easily with the tide. Having settled to do this, we returned into the house and went to bed. I lay down with the greater part of my clothes on, and slept well for a few hours. When I awoke, the wind had risen, and the sign of the house, the ship, was creaking and banging about, with noises that startled me. Rising softly, for my charge lay fast asleep, I looked out of the window. It commanded the causeway where we had hauled up our boat, and as my eyes adapted themselves to the light of the clouded moon, I saw two men looking into her. They passed by under the window, looking at nothing else, and they did not go down to the landing place, which I could discern to be empty, but struck across the marsh in the direction of the Nore. My first impulse was to call up Herbert and show him the two men going away, but reflecting before I got into his room, which was at the back of the house and adjoined mine, that he and Startup had had a harder day than I, and were fatigued, I forbore, going back to my window. I could see the two men over the marsh. In that light, however, I soon lost them, and feeling very cold, lay down to think of the matter, and fell asleep again. We were up early, as we walked to and fro, all four together before breakfast. I deemed it right to recount what I had seen. Again, our charge was the least anxious of the party. It was very likely that the men belonged to the custom house, he said quietly, and that they had no thought of us. I tried to persuade myself that it was so, as indeed it might easily be. However, I proposed that he and I should walk away together to a distant point we could see, and that the boat should take us aboard there, or as near there as might prove feasible, at about noon. This being considered a good precaution, soon after breakfast he and I set forth, without saying anything, at the tavern. He smoked his pipe as we went along, and sometimes stopped to clap me on the shoulder. One would have supposed that it was I who was in danger, not he, and that he was reassuring me. We spoke very little. As we approached the point, I begged him to remain in a sheltered place, while I went on to reconnoitre, for it was towards it that the men had passed in the night. He complied, and I went on alone. There was no boat off the point, nor any boat drawn up anywhere near it. Nor were there any signs of the men having embarked there. But, to be sure, the tide was high, and there might have been some footprints under water. When he looked out from his shelter in the distance, and saw that I waved my hat for him to come up, he rejoined me, and there we waited, sometimes lying on the bank wrapped in our coats, and sometimes moving about to warm ourselves, until we saw our boat coming round. We got aboard easily and rowed out into the track of the steamer. By that time it wanted but 10 minutes of 1 o'clock, and we began to look out for her smoke. But it was 1:30 before we saw her smoke, and soon afterwards we saw behind it the smoke of another steamer. As they were coming on at full speed, we got the two bags ready, and took that opportunity of saying good-bye to Herbert and Startop. We had all shaken hands cordially, and neither Herbert's eyes nor mine were quite dry, when I saw a 4-oared galley shoot out from under the bank but a little way ahead of us and row out into the same track. A stretch of shore had been as yet between us and steamer smoke, by reason of the bend and wind of the river, but now she was visible, coming head on. I called to Herbert and Startop to keep before the tide, that she might see us lying by for her, and I adjured Provis to sit quite still, wrapped in his cloak. He answered cheerily, "Trust to me, dear boy," and sat like a statue. Meantime the galley, which was very skilfully handled, had crossed us, let us come up with her, and fallen alongside, leaving just room enough for the play of the oars. She kept alongside, drifting when we drifted, and pulling a stroke or two when we pulled. Of the two sitters, one held the rudder lines, and looked at us attentively, as did all the rowers. The other sitter was wrapped up much as Provis was, and seemed to shrink and whisper some instruction to the steer as he looked at us. Not a word was spoken in either boat. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe. It greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.